that brought him undone on work choices. The modern Labor Party is partly defined by the model of state Labor governments, developed during the Howard era, starting with the Carr government in New South Wales. The features of this model are control of government through the Premier's office and department, a relentless focus on the media message, policy caution, using incumbency to bolster Labor's support network, and destruction of the opposition as a viable force. Related to this is the sophistication of the lobbying process in Canberra and the influence of special interest groups over the public interest. The special interest group industry is now huge in Canberra. The role of lobbying has expanded enormously in the national capital. By contrast, there's no lobby for the public interest. I want to make one final point about obstacles to reform. Technology in the 21st century is creating a new sense of individual empowerment. Institutions that once moulded mass loyalties from the church to the trade union to the RSL to the local newspaper are diminished. So it is with political parties. Once they assumed voter loyalty, now voters have to be won over or purchased. In a more diverse society with multimedia options, each person, if you like, becomes an empowered focus group. The result is that it's much more difficult to build a consensus for policy reform across the community. I now want to look briefly and make an historical digression and look at some of the factors that underpinned reform over the last 25 years. I won't dwell on this, but I think it is an interesting exercise, and essentially it's an historical exercise, looking at what happened from the early 1980s onwards. Now, the first point I want to make is that Hawke-Keating reform was driven by an urgency. There was a pervasive sense in the early 1980s of national stagnation and decline, symbolised, of course, by the early 1980s recession. Australia's annual average GDP growth during the Fraser era was only 2%, disappointing in historical terms and by international comparisons. Unemployment got to around 9% during the early 1980s recession. And there was a feeling that this national stagnation had to be addressed. Second, this coincided with the arrival of a new government led by a very popular Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, who was also very astute in policy terms. The Hawke-Keating government was remarkably free from Labor dogma, which had ruined the Whitlam government, and it was prepared to look at new policy approaches with a fresh eye. And this leads to the third factor, that it arrived and there was a set of ideas waiting for it, ideas which had been developed over a period of time in agencies such as the Treasury, the Reserve Bank and the Industries Assistance Commission. These ideas had some support in the federal parliament and quite a lot in the policy media. And these ideas were essentially freer trade, smaller government, deregulation of markets, lower tax rates within a fairer tax system, a more flexible labour market, low inflation, an attack on economic rent seekers, and a more market-orientated economy. These ideas came from the top down. There's no doubt that the intellectual momentum of 1980s reforms was elite-driven. However, it took a popular politician such as Hawke to sell them to the community. The next point I want to make is that Hawke and Keating had a formal contract for consensus, if you like. It's accord with the trade union movement. And the accord represented a choice by the union movement to switch from an industrial to a political strategy, to give priority to an economic reform agenda and growth strategy with the Labor Party. And this meant, of course, that these reforms were often negotiated, in fact largely negotiated first with the unions through the accord, which created the basis for consensus, or at least move towards a consensus. Another element that was really important in these reforms was the commitment to equity. For the Hawke government, social and economic equity was absolutely vital. Equity was integral to the accord, to Labor's own constituency, and as a tactic in selling its economic reforms. But equity was vital in another sense. Equity was part of the reform agenda itself. It was an aim in its own right. The next point is that John Howard is right to argue that in the 1980s, the coalition in opposition supported many of Labor's reform directions. In fact, the opposition was usually attacking the Labor government for not going further and faster. Far from complaining that Labor was engaged in rip-and-tear reformism, the coalition's typical position during this period of time was that Labor, in fact, had been too timid. Now, this gave Hawke and Keating great political flexibility and the chance to occupy the middle ground, which they essentially did. And the final point I want to make about this period is that I think that the Hawke government, particularly Hawke and Keating, its two leaders, was very effective at putting and winning the intellectual and political case for these policies. I mean, they actually argued the case for the policies. They didn't engage in spin, they didn't engage in slogans, they actually went out and argued the merit of the policies. And for a considerable time, Paul Keating, as Treasurer, carried the media, much of the media, behind him and his policies. Above all, Bob Hawke kept winning elections. And it was Hawke's election victories that cemented the new agenda. Not much point introducing a new reform and then losing an election on the reform like Howard did in 2007. But the fact that Hawke kept winning elections on the basis of his reforms entrenched them in the community. Even after the debilitating early 1990s recession, reformism remained alive. The great gain, of course, from the recession was an independent central bank, inflation targeting, and a new era of low inflation. The Keating government advanced enterprise bargaining, occupational-based superannuation to 9%, and introduced national competition policy. The Howard government entrenched new fiscal rules, discharged public debt, entrenched full central bank independence, completed a major GST-led tax reform, forced through reform on the waterfront, further liberalised the labour market with the support of the Democrats in 1996, made some decisive privatisations, and presided over a system of sound financial institution supervision and regulation. The great irony of Kevin Rudd is his failure to live up to the expectations he created in opposition and in government, and to deliver the mandate he won at the 2007 election. Rudd promised an ETS. He pledged to revive COAG and to fix the Federation. He pledged a new era of human capital investment he called an education revolution, and no Prime Minister has ever talked so much about productivity. Well, I won't dissect the Rudd government here. Suffice to say that Ruddism was a phenomenon undermined by too many contradictions because it was too egocentric and failed utterly to determine its core priorities. So where do we go from here? Let me offer some thoughts. First, we need to rekindle our understanding of political leadership. And this is a matter of high reflection for both sides of politics. I think this is possible because the public is sick and tired of spin and inaction. These are parts of the malaise of New South Wales Labor, which will see it dismissed from office next year. This means that Labor leaders must reclaim their government and their historic mission as a party from the party apparatchiks and brokers and spin merchants who are so persuasive in terms of the advice they've given the leaders. Perhaps Julia Gillard might have gone through some road to Damascus during the course of this recent election campaign. We'll see if she wins and what she does afterwards. I think that there is evidence that as the proportion of swinging voters increases in the community, more adverse judgments will apply to political leaders who merely seek to avoid the real issues and real problems with cosmetics. Secondly, there is an encouraging feature of the current campaign. Both sides seem to me to be following a stance of fiscal restraint. Indeed, their bottom lines are not very different. Neither will jeopardise the return to surplus in 3 years. This campaign has not repeated the big spending commitments we saw in earlier election campaigns. Both sides seem genuinely committed to the debt reduction when the surplus is achieved. I think none of these points should be underestimated given the depth of the fiscal and debt crisis in both Europe and America. Thirdly, we shouldn't underestimate the groundwork laid in this country in recent years for future policy advances. There is, I think, widespread recognition in the community of the problems and the challenges. And in some areas there's been considerable, very considerable policy work done in these areas. I refer